So good morning, everybody. I'm Mike Albertson. I'm the Deputy Director here at the Center for Global Security Research. Thanks as always for taking the time out of your morning or your afternoon, depending on where you are, to join us. It's my sincere pleasure today to welcome Dr. Steve Flanagan, who's Adjunct Senior Fellow at the RAND Corporation, for a CGSR talk titled A Framework of Deterrence in Space Operations. His talk is going to summarize a new RAND report that presents a framework on the nature and requirements of deterrence in space operations. Katie's going to put a link to that full report here in the chat as Steve starts his remarks, so everyone can take a look at that report, can download that report, can maybe bring up some questions to Steve from that report that maybe isn't covered in the slides. Just a little bit of background on the topic. CGSR has done a annual space workshop here for the last several years, with our colleagues here working on space issues at the lab. Our next workshop on the topic here is going to be in a couple of weeks. I just encourage people who are interested in this topic, who are tuning in, to go to the CGSR website, to read the reports from the previous workshops, to take a look at the annotated bibliographies that we've done for those workshops, which may help give you some reading material on the subject, how sort of thought has evolved on the subject over the last several years. But I think Steve's discussion is going to be a great tee up for that topic and for people who are interested in that here at the lab. I'll just say a little bit about the speaker. In addition to his duties at the RAND Corporation, Dr. Flanagan is an adjunct professor of security studies at Georgetown University. He has a lot of research interests, including U.S. defense strategy, alliance and partnership relations, regional security in Europe-Eurasia, strategic deterrence, and outer space security, which we'll talk about today. He served in senior positions in the U.S. government for over 4 decades. Most recently, he was Special Assistant to the President and Senior Director for Defense Policy at the National Security Council from 2013 to 2015, which is, I will testify, one of the most difficult jobs both at the NSC and the government, given all of the things that you have to cover. He chaired the Interagency Policy Committee on Space Security. Before that, he was a Senior Director for Central and Eastern Europe at the NSC. He was the National Intelligence Officer for Europe. He was Associate Director and member of State Department's Policy Planning Staff, and he was a professional staff member on the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence. He's also had a number of faculty positions and a number of very sort of impressive credentials on his academic resume, including a PhD in International Relations from the Fletcher School at Tufts. For those of you who are unfamiliar with sort of the ground rules of these CGSR lectures, Dr. Flan's going to talk for 30 to 45 minutes. He'll have some slides which he'll present to us. At that point, when his remarks are concluded, we'll open the floor up for discussion. To make my life easier, please raise your hand electronically. Please submit your questions in the chat function. You don't have to wait until Steve concludes his remarks. If something piques your interest while he's talking, feel free to get those questions in and hands up, and then it makes our life easier because we can just sort of kick off the discussion when he concludes. He has a couple of colleagues who might join in for the question and answer period. So, feel free to ask what you want to ask, and we'll direct those questions and try to get as many of them in as possible during that period remaining. So, thank you so much, Steve, for taking the time to be with us here today, and look forward to this presentation. And over to you for your remarks.
Great. Thanks, Mike. Thanks very much for that gracious introduction, and also to Katie for the arrangements, and Brad for the invitation. All your colleagues, I've really benefited from my interactions with CGSR over the years on these issues and other things, and so I'm really delighted to have this opportunity and presenting this work that has been under development at RAND over the last several years. I am joined online. I think he's only on his phone. However, my colleague Nick Martin, who was with RAND until last year, is now a senior engineer at Aerospace in Colorado Springs, and who was a big part of this effort and graciously agreed to join, and he'll chime in on some of the Q&A and other things. So anyway, I look forward. So I do have about 7 or so slides. I'll run through some of those, and again, happy to be interrupted along the way, and see if there are issues you'd like to discuss. So let me just say a work. So our title of toward a framework of deterrence in space operations. We were really operating on the assumption that first of all, that there was no agreed definition within the government or the or the wider space community as to what deterrence in space operations. We'd hear the often heard refrain that you can't isolate space from other parts of the overall integrated, especially with all the emphasis on integrated deterrence these days, that, how would you separate out? But we did think it was useful and were asked because there wasn't this kind of agreed framework. Our sponsor in the U.S. government, who preferred to not be mentioned in our final report, partly so not look as if they were taking any kind of a position on this issue and other considerations. But this was all open source work. It did draw on some of our own experience and other analysis in gaming, which I'll mention in a minute, but that was classified. But this was all open source information that we were looking at, trying to help. So we start with this notion. Well, first of all, what do we mean by space deterrence? So that first bullet was to essentially to discourage an adversary from taking actions to disrupt or destroy U.S. space assets. That was really the main point that we sort of tried to focus on. And really, there was the sponsor wanted two sort of elements of this, both to develop this framework about what were the requirements of deterrence, but also understanding how adversaries could be deterred from taking those kind of actions against U.S. space assets, and maybe even be dissuaded from even undertaking certain counter space capabilities. And that we discuss in more detail in the report. So going to the second bullet, we started out with reviewing the classical and recent deterrence literature. There was a lot of work, of course, by RAND and CGSR and other organizations that we plowed through. We weren't trying to cast any or pave any new ground in that area. It was more to develop what are the relevant lessons from deterrence in nuclear and space, nuclear and cyber, I mean, that for space, and how might some of that literature inform some of the discussion. We had also drawn on some other previous RAND work on space. There's been quite a bit of research at RAND earlier, going back even to 2010. There's a study that you'll see that we cite in our report by Forrest Morgan that highlighted, and this was done back in 2010, the interdependence between general deterrence and space deterrence. But he also noted that if adversary leaders assessed that attacking U.S. space systems would degrade overall U.S. space capabilities and warfighting capabilities sufficiently to realize the adversary's objectives in a conflict at acceptable costs, that general deterrence could be eroded. Conversely, if those same leaders believed that attacking U.S. space systems presented unacceptable risks of conflict escalation, deterrence in the terrestrial regime could be reinforced by the knowledge that U.S. space forces would be operating with the full benefit of U.S. space support. So, and this calculus, would apply to other countries with significant space assets. So, as Forrest noted in that study, he concluded that in some, effective space deterrence fortifies general deterrence and stability. So, definitely recognizing the interactions between the two. So we proceeded, looking at some of that baseline literature that we could build on, and certainly a lot of other good work, which we the very first footnote, we note a number of other studies that have been done in the community on elements of space deterrence. But we tried in this report, we think, to bring together a more comprehensive and integrated approach and in developing these typologies or archetypes of deterrence that we outline. So we compared also several national approaches to space deterrence in the process of developing these three archetypes that I'll talk about in a few moments, and without necessarily branding, absolutely, what each one was, but that certainly a number of these national approaches reflect. And we also looked at kind of what the nature and requirements of space deterrence were. And what really, how would you define success in space deterrence, given that there's no way that it can be, absolutely effective as perhaps one might hope for in elements of nuclear deterrence, where you would completely avoid any kind of nuclear use through an effective deterrent strategy in space. That is probably certainly a bridge too far in our analysis. So let me turn to the next slide then. So as I say, we looked at the foundational principles of deterrence and how they apply to the space, how they apply to space. Certainly, the two main elements of classical deterrence strategy: denial, to demonstrate the capacity to blunt or defeat an adversary's attack, and then, of course, punishment, threatening severe consequences to convince an adversary that the objectionable action or aggression has an unacceptable cost. And then, of course, we've noted that there have always been kind of mixed elements of that in both strategies. Um, and then we turn to a lot of the discussion that has grown, particularly over the last 15 years or so, about tailored deterrence. Some of the work that Elaine Bunn and others in the NPR in 2008, and then again in 2018, looked at this issue of how can you look at more tailored deterrence to address the risk calculus of various adversaries across the conflict spectrum. I'm sorry, I meant the 2006 QDR. Which address this notion that the diverse challenges posed by the emergence of advanced military competitors, regional powers armed with weapons of mass destruction, and non-state terrorist networks that created, some of these new challenges. And so, how could you achieve that kind of a tailored deterrence, and what were the requirements? Requiring a detailed assessment of the leadership and society of another government, and how you can influence their calculus through diplomatic, informational, and economic instruments. And of course, it also requires a clear and credible messaging and a feedback loop, an assessment to determine the impact of what your messaging and signaling has done in terms of the adversary's calculus. We also looked at other influences: strategic stability, crisis stability, and arms race stability. All of those, classic terms, I'm sure, are familiar to most everyone on this call. So I won't go into that, but we could come back to that and how how those factors might influence. And then we also looked at dissuasion. Would it be possible, and certainly this has been a thrust of some of U.S. policy over the last decade, to try to even convince potential challengers that developing of certain menacing counterspace capabilities or initiating hostile action against U.S. space capabilities and allied and partner capabilities would be futile. And so this, of course, dissuasion was a major feature of the Reagan administration strategy in the 1980s to convince the Soviet Union that it couldn't win the arms race. The 2001 QDR also talked about, citing the power of U.S. research and development, test and demonstration programs, and certain other advantages in key areas. And then again, the 2018 National Strategy for Space and the 2020 Defense Space Strategy Summary also reflected elements of dissuasion and sort of trying to convince adversaries that advancing down, an aggressive counter space action program might be ineffective. So turning then to what did we look at in the nuclear domain, or what did we find was most helpful? Because certainly there's been a number of studies that have talked about this, and we cite some work by a very good work that was done a number of years ago by Michael Crepon and some other colleagues, a couple of edited volumes that looked at this, the nuclear lessons. And certainly there are 5 concepts well known, of course, to people who've studied strategic deterrence over the years that are relevant to space: credibility, deterrent stability, the offense-defense aversion, crisis stability, and escalation control. So, of course, credibility is the cornerstone of nuclear deterrence, and the will and capacity to retaliate. And it includes, including with nuclear weapons, if an ally or an extended, or to an ally, if an extended guarantee is attacked. And of course, Brad and Roberts and others have done some great work in that area. On the issue of deterrent stability, of course, mutual assured destruction was seen as stable. In other words, targeting cities or targeting key military capabilities was seen as stable, but defensive cities, was seen as potentially having an offensive dimension and deploying capabilities to limit. So we analogize to that, to the space domain, saying, developing capabilities to limit and clean up space debris from a destructive ASAT weapon could be considered somewhat offense oriented in thinking about how that lesson might apply to space deterrence. And then, of course, the superiority sufficiency dilemma, in crisis stability, and this is where we talk particularly about some of the impact, how we should think about this with regard to our messaging, that seeking superior space warfighting capability to disrupt or destroy adversary assets, or at least suggesting that that is your posture, whatever your capabilities are, risks causing adversaries to conclude that you have a highly offensive counterspace doctrine, and that the war will begin rapidly and rapidly extend into space, and which at a time when, particularly as the U.S. was seeing itself as particularly vulnerable, given the enormous dependence of the U.S. military on space services to conduct warfare, and worried that perhaps not all of the programs for defense and resilience were in place, that taking too assertive or posturing might actually trigger hostile powers, and particularly given that we know that China already has a different approach we'll talk about earlier and later, and Russia as well, that this might trigger undesirable consequences. So yes, we do believe that, drawing on the earlier point that the lesson of nuclear, you need to have some assured capacity for second strike, but you and to target hostile space counter space capabilities, but be careful how you posture that at risk of initiating a conflict that does great damage to space assets early on in a conflict, and how can you ensure that you don't have that risk of rolling down the security dilemma road. And then there's also this issue of escalation. There was, some earlier RAND studies talked about that, you really, it shouldn't really, it's not necessarily an uncontrolled escalation, but more of an escalation descent, the slippery slope, the kind of calibrating responses to attack and traversing a dangerous mountainside that, with the bottom slope representing the most extreme level of escalation, and that you wanted to have some kind of hand and footholds to control escalatory descent. And so this whole notion of, how could you, what were some of the analogs in space to provide off ramps and ability to control escalation, and that where cyber had some interesting inputs. And I'm turning to that third bullet. That some of the challenges of deterring attacks in cyber parallel those for space, and of course there's a lot of interaction between or cyber attacks that have counter space effects or goals. But from the cyber literature, we found, and looking at some things that Joseph Nye and Charlie Glazer and others have done in looking at cyber deterrence, some of the similar challenges are there. Attribution, credibility, proportionality of response, ability to control escalation, and of course the challenge that cyber attacks can be conducted by proxies and third parties, and not immediately conducive to attribution. But we think overall that there's been some progress on that, and increasingly, some of that concern is more manageable. But there is this issue of the similar to space about proportionality, in cyber and space, and until you get to the point where you're talking about, potentially catastrophic cyber attacks that would have, attack critical infrastructure or cause nuclear reactors to melt down or whatever. You get to the point where it's hard to it might be hard for a nation in the midst of a crisis to justify overly reacting, to some cyber attacks. So too in space, the loss of one or two space assets. First of all, you might need to prove to the global community that that's happened, and we've seen that in some of the gaming we've done. Disinformation, lots of ways in which adversaries might try to fuzz up the information environment. But on the other hand, you want to have some capacity to control escalation and ensure that there's not a rapid ascent into massive counter space activities, as with cyber. Both have the situation of, or where cyber and space both have reversible kind of hostile actions that can be taken that give you some ladder for de-escalation or ratcheting back. And so that was another thing that we looked at as a potential lesson from cyber. But in general, we felt that cyber told us that we really want to look at carefully calibrated retaliatory actions, and not necessarily in kind either. That there may be other ways that you respond. And certainly, I think in this concept of integrated deterrence and looking at full spectrum, and certainly with the recent DoD report on space policy, that I think that's reflected in that approach. So we turned then to looking at some of the differing national concepts on space, and particularly the two most important adversaries I'll focus on. In our study, we also looked at some allies and partners, both France and Japan, which are also developing both important space surveillance capabilities, situational awareness capabilities, and also capacity to defend their assets. But we focused mostly or heavily on China and Russia as, of course, the most important potential adversaries in targeting U.S. and allied space assets. So we, looking at China, of course, China has a guiding ideology that space information. First of all, that space, operations are key to information dominance and very much integrated into their overall concept of active defense. The Chinese concept of Wuxi combines, however, we found Western concepts of deterrence and compellence, because it really is talking about literally, and it goes towards a bit of dissuasion, convincing the opponent to refrain from actions and submit, as they say, as in that arrow under the second bullet, to submit to the deterrer's volition, meaning China. And this is documented heavily in a lot of the Academy of Military Science documents that we drew on that are available through the, some very good translations now available through the Air University's space research program, if you haven't seen them. But Nathan Beauchamp Mustafa, who worked on our project, was able to look at some of these in the original Chinese text as well, and they've been quite forthright in some of these writings about this concept, and others, of course, other China hands have done a lot of good work in this. But this notion that it does really include this idea of domination of information space and local wars, and there really is kind of a notion of escalating. Really, what the Chinese approach is, looking at the notion and going to that last bullet of escalating displays of counter space capabilities, moving of assets around some of the shock, and moving towards what they even refer to, and I don't know whether this is a good translation of the Chinese, but certainly they may be keying off some of the way that was used in some of the U.S. debate during the Gulf War, of shock and awe kinds of attacks on adversary space systems early on in a conflict, again to achieve that notion of submitting, of having the United States or another opponent to submit to their volition, to basically to cease and desist. And there's some elements of the Russian approach that reflect that kind of thinking too, but very much the Chinese have a concept that we feel, certainly in some of their writings and some other aspects of demonstrated in other activities, that they're moving to an approach whereby they would sort of take some action against U.S. space assets at a point when they thought that the U.S. was about to take some action that they thought was going to be greatly inimical to their interests and or potentially target some of their space systems. So there's kind of a notion that they're ready to take some action at that point, right on the cusp of a move towards a higher level of conflict. So on turning to Russia on the right side of that box, the 2014 Russian military doctrine talked about space information, space supremacy as being decisive in future conflicts as states seek information dominance. They certainly recognize that the U.S. reliance on space is an Achilles heel that the U.S. has been, of course, working to rectify over the last decade almost now, and even earlier with some enhancements we can talk about later about to resilience and to defense of space systems. But their counter space doctrine, turning to that second bullet, does talk about deterring, using space counter space to deter aggression and to control escalation through selective targeting of adversary space systems and supporting infrastructure. That strategic operations to destroy critical important targets, the SODSIT concept that has been much discussed, seeks to meter and damage and seize or take the initiative in certain counter space activities from our assessment and looking at their open source literature. And we've done some looking at that. Alexis Blank on our team dove into some of that literature, but there's been a number of other folks who've looked at that closely. The Russians not quite as open in some of their writings on this, but it's certainly out there in some of their military academy publications and elsewhere. But their new generation warfare strategy of cross-domain coercion, of integrating indications and warning and threat of integrating information warfare and threat of non-nuclear precision strike, limited nuclear strike to deter and compel adversaries is all part of this overall concept. At the same time, as they increasingly are reliant on space for some of their operations, it's very clear in their literature that they are seeking to reduce or limit their reliance, or at least have access to other kinds of local ISR and command and control capabilities. And of course, when they're involved in fighting along their periphery, as in the war in Ukraine, or perhaps some future attack against NATO Europe in the northeastern Europe in the Baltics, they certainly have lots of airborne and other assets that they can rely on to provide ISR and other command and control capabilities. And they, sort of recognizing, and this was noted in the recent DoD report on space strategy. So then I'll turn to the three archetypes that we developed in trying to look at how these, how would we categorize what the main approaches to space deterrence could be, or again, just focusing on that issue of how can you reduce the inclination of hostile powers to disrupt or degrade certain key space assets, and focusing just on that domain. And this was also important, just in terms of categorizing it. Both provided insights into how should U.S. and allied policy evolve, but also how would you be able, how could you assess and begin to understand, perhaps in a fuller way, the nature of some of the potential adversaries' approach to space deterrence, and also some of our U.S. partners. So the first one we came to was a denial dominant, one that relies heavily on resilience and the use of stealth, of defensive measures and redundancy. I won't go into in detail here, but the French and the Japanese approach are very much in this domain, although they are both developing, both governments are developing capabilities to take action to defend their space assets coming under attack, and that's still evolving. The French, I think, are a little bit further ahead in that area. The Japanese are coming along as part of their overall rejiggering of their defense concepts and enhancing their overall deterrent capabilities. Denial dominant may include, as I say, some active defenses, but really a limited capacity to degrade the space system of other countries. That may have been where the U.S. was, 10 years ago or so, or at least certainly not advertising that there were these capabilities. But that obviously has been evolving, as has been documented in some of the recent statements by the Air Force, by the Secretary of Air Force, and in this defense space report earlier this month. But denial dominance also would place a heavy focus on regulating of use of force in space through norms and sanctions for bad behavior. This whole effort over the last several years to accelerate support, international support that the U.S. and other allied and partner countries have been advocating to promote responsible space behavior, even as Russia and China continue to, push these much less effective regimes that they've been talking about on peaceful uses of space, which, completely ignore some of the very aggressive counter space activities that they're pursuing and focusing on this idea of, more on their concerns about, use of space to attack ground targets as opposed to attacks in the space domain. So the second type of overall deterrence we talked about, or looking at these lessons of these other domains and the various national perspectives, was a mixed deterrence, which includes a mix of resilience and defensive measures, but also a somewhat more robust active defense of space assets, having some capacity to degrade the space systems of other countries, and perhaps demonstrating those through exercises, through doctrinal writings, other things that would again, with that notion of drawing from the lessons of nuclear deterrence, that there'd be some credible, sense of credibility of the capacity and the will to respond to hostile actions against space systems. But this approach didn't, and certainly doesn't need to. And I think this is really where, particularly in light of the recent DoD report, I think this is very much where kind of we would say today the U.S. falls, where there's moving in that direction of making clear that third bullet, that there is some capacity to degrade other systems, but also not moving away from and continuing to promote that notion that it's important to try to regulate the use of force in space through norms and sanctions, and developing these rules of responsible space behavior, including the announcement that the Vice President made about the U.S. eschewing any kind of debris creating ASAT tests in the future. Coming on the heels, of course, of the recent Russian and Indian tests that have caused so many problems in terms of the debris creation, not to mention the potential destabilizing effect of those attacks in a crisis. So lastly, we looked at offense dominant, and here clearly that red color is no accident. We're certainly thinking of China and Russia here without necessarily naming them per se, but yes, there is some elements of resilience and denial. As I talked about, the Russians talking about having backup systems. The Chinese certainly have robust non-space means to support their ISR and information and command and control in particularly within their immediate periphery. But it does definitely, both countries have moved more towards a reliance on punishment, an emphasis on a wide array of counter space weapons and capabilities, and demonstrating the capability to severely degrade the space systems of other countries. And this, of course, has been documented well in the various DIA reports on the threats to space systems, and also summarized in the recent DoD report. Here, the norms aren't a priority. There really isn't that sense of much trust in others to uphold them, and certainly, as I said, the Russians and the Chinese both continue to, in the various UN fora, continue to push these really not very credible treaties on the peaceful use of outer space. So lastly, we looked at and here and Nick did a lot of good work. Who's online to come jump in on some of the questions during that next session, part of the session. We looked at really how you define success and failure in space deterrence, and really it's important to we think to emphasize that it's not binary. Where in nuclear you might say that there is or at least certainly many people would feel that that nuclear deterrence had failed if you had even a limited nuclear use, or it certainly would be, and then the risk of escalation. But in space, we really think we need to look at a spectrum weighing differing requirements for space services at various phases of conflict, and how how that might impact also how you respond, both either in the space domain or in a horizontal way to respond to those attacks. And certainly as you build resilience, as you build the capacity for reconstitution of space assets, which certainly the Chinese seem to have, and I believe the United States is doing. You do, and of course, relying more on commercial and partner assets, you do have the capacity to sort of ride out initial attacks at least, and that you want to not be thinking that all is lost, even if some key assets are lost in the earlier space assets are lost in the early phases. It is, of course, impacted by, the success is impacted by the overall state of general deterrence and conflict in other domains. So, we note which I think many people who followed this over the years would say was certainly a pointedly obvious finding, but really the prospects for complete success are very limited, particularly reversible attacks on space systems. There's very low risk of deterring those because of the fact that adversaries may think that there's a limited risk of a robust response or escalation. Nonetheless, there is certainly that sense of what we talked about earlier, that potential downward slope that you could see as you begin to go down that path, and so we also thought that you really need to look at how we can mitigate escalation, even in the context of limited reversible attacks, or what signaling and how messaging can impact that. So our overall conclusion is that the comprehensive approach to space deterrence is probably the most effective, one that would mitigate damage and preserve essential capabilities through resilience and investments in redundancy and growing use of allied and partner capabilities and commercial systems, some mix of defensive and offensive counter space capabilities and actions, continuing to promote those norms of space behavior, and that redundancy and reconstitution as well, as part of that effort. But also the notion of providing a certain kind of assurances, which a number of our allies talk about, even as you talk about a robust deterrence, assurances that there may be certain kinds of activities that we won't undertake. For example, excuse me, the U.S. Commitment to not undertake debris creating ASAT attacks, or at least that would be something that we would eschew in a crisis. But also off ramps that might be able to encourage and deter an adversary to terminate counter space actions, and also to help to de-escalation in the overall conflict. So lastly, we looked a bit more to this issue of the impact of messaging, of revelation of certain capabilities and norms, and how that might impact our overall deterrent posture and success of deterrence. We do think that strategic messaging has an important impact on the effectiveness of space deterrence, how messages are conveyed and calibrated, and the importance of consistency across various levels of government. And messaging, of course, is not only formal policy pronouncements, but informal comments by political and military leaders, doctrinal publications, and comments and publications by officials linked to professional military education institutions, other ways. And we've seen this. I know this is certainly, we know that in some other work we did, a study that Alexis and Nathan and I did last year, looking at how the Russians and Chinese perceive U.S. space capabilities. And over the years, the Chinese and the Russians have definitely looked towards some of these publications. And indeed, there was a very interesting study that was done by a group of graduate students, I think at George Washington University, who looked at what was available on the open source about U.S. Or what the Chinese and Russians might think about U.S. counter space capabilities. And it was pretty revealing how they looked at a lot of these sources to suggest that maybe the U.S. did have a great deal of capability for offensive counter space actions. And maybe that was the intent. So anyway, we talk about that more in the discussion, but we think that these messages, of course, are actualized and amplified by on-orbit operations, Space Force training, national and multinational military space exercises, text of new space systems, and of course acquisitions of space capabilities. All of these things have some impact, but the feedback loop is really critically important. Sort of, how do you know that some of your messaging is really being received, or how has it been assessed? And I think that the SSDP program at Space Command and is focused heavily on that, and plus cultural sensitivity. We found in some gaming that we did a few years ago, the GSAP program, for example, which the U.S. has cast as a very benign sort of program, analogous to the Neighborhood Watch, would not necessarily be assuring to totalitarian countries who are used to heavy surveillance by their intelligence services. So saying that GSAP is just simply, monitoring the neighborhood, looking at space activities to enhance space situation awareness. Those kinds of things are things that maybe may not be readily evident, but and we've done some more work on this in the classified realm that's available on our website. We did some work for General D.T. Thompson at AFSPC last year that's available on our website, our classified website. And then lastly, revelation of capabilities. And this is a very interesting area. Our colleague, Bonnie Triesenberg, had done some very good work, actually her dissertation at the Rand Graduate School on this. She and Crystal Langelen both using game theoretic modeling and that how selective revelation in peacetime can bolster the credibility of deterrence and crisis stability, but also revealing certain capabilities in a crisis could be seen as coercive and escalatory. So again, that's something else that I think we need to look at as we talk about this issue of how much you want to say. And I think that certainly is animating some of the hesitancy of folks in the government today about what we say about what capabilities we have for or counter space action and how they might be employed. On the other hand, some revelation of those is certainly important to the credibility of deterrence. And lastly, we do think that norms of space behavior, well, certainly they're not enforceable, that they aren't perfect by any means, but that they could enhance deterrence by setting rules and thresholds whose violation would at least provide additional warning of hostile intent. So again, not certainly a fail-safe, and certainly something we would rely on, but as part of an overall integrated approach to deterrence in the space domain, we do think that those can be a bit somewhat helpful. So anyway, I'll stop here, and I look forward to the discussion and your comments and questions. So thanks very much. And again, my colleague Nick can also chime in as he sees fit.